Hey there folks, the number one Rise Against fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Rise Against record, Ricochet. Even the biggest Rise Against fans could never deny that they are not a group known for their versatility, because as far as melodic hardcore bands go, there have been a number of bands that have demonstrated multitudes and evolution over the course of their career. Rise Against is not one of them, because while AFI went from horror-themed skate punks to an outright emo pop rock band, while Bad Religion dabbled in progressive space rock a couple decades earlier and eventually started incorporating power pop influences into their main melodic hardcore sound, and the general tides of punk changed from one year to the next, Rise Against largely remained the same, and while this is either a positive mark or a major detriment towards the quality of their overall catalog to you, depending on how connected you are to their core sound, it is something that remained consistently true, that an ever-evolving sound was rarely ever what people tuned into Rise Against releases for. And rather, the band managed to actually make up for it, rather than just be known as the AC/DC of punk, which, let's face it, that is a title that could go to several punk bands. They became known for their politically aware lyrics and their general activism both within and outside of their body of work. Never as outright angry as a band like Against Me, nor as nihilistic as some punk bands within the crustier and more radical sides of the genre. Rise Against brought a smooth and palatable, yet at the same time frequently protestive, lyrical quality to the more popular side of punk, a sound that could make the oftentimes preteen to teenage Tony Hawk kind of audience that was listening to a lot of their music feel like revolutionaries. And now here we are in 2025 with the world seemingly on fire around us, and Rise Against delivers what may be both their worst and least political album to date. Truly amazing. It is important to recognize that Ricochet is a pretty giant change in sound for Rise Against, and depending on who you ask, that is a welcome change no matter what that change is, because while they may seem difficult to hate upon first glance or upon a single listen, it isn't hard to imagine growing weary of the exact same melodic hardcore sound that Rise Against have been delivering on almost every record that they've put out for the nearly 25 years that they've been putting out music at this point. It's not a bad sound whatsoever, but it certainly isn't the kind of band that you want to do a deep Discog dive into and then be met with virtually the same record repeated ad nauseum. But Ricochet actually manages to make what is perhaps the first truly earnest, first major step that Rise Against have ever really made in stepping away from their classic melodic hardcore sound into doing something that's different, trying to change up their sound so they sound like something other than just a band putting out weaker and weaker versions of records like 2006's The Sufferer and The Witness or 2008's Appeal to Reason. The unfortunate reality, however, is that despite that change most likely being made in earnest, it also sees the band fall flat on their collective face. I mean, you remove the three-chord punk energy from Rise Against, and what do you really have left? They try to incorporate some more anthemic choruses throughout the record, something that admittedly isn't extremely rare for them, but they turn into a beast that at the end of the day can best be described as adult contemporary hardcore. Because while Rise Against has always been a pretty immediately accessible band for those with little to no prior experience with punk and its various subgenres, it was always inarguable that Rise Against were a punk band at heart, but Ricochet does not convey that idea whatsoever. It comes across as somewhere between sort of tepid up-tempo indie rock and a stadium rock band taking a stab at what they perceive to be political punk. A relatively pointless feature from Manchester Orchestra's Andy Hull on Black Crown certainly doesn't help their case either, and just feels like a pretty desperate attempt by the band to feel at least tangentially related to this kind of direction and genre that they really have no prior history with whatsoever, this branch of alternative rock that frankly they've never really been in touch with in the first place at all throughout the course of their career. And it's that kind of, and I hate to use this word because it is very oversaturated, but I feel like it does apply here, sellout kind of sound that feels like the final nails in the coffin of any chance that Rise Against had at all of convincing people that they could be something different, because every moment of this album is bombastic in tone, yet unremarkable compositionally, leaving Rise Against change in sound to feel like a step in an even safer direction, which, while a new Rise Against album is never something I'm going to predict to be especially great, that is perhaps the worst and just most outright baffling creative decision that they could have made. The one-dimensional nature of the production here really adds to the feeling that they're trying to integrate themselves into the songs that play at the end of soap operas kind of crowd, because tracks like Gold, Long Gone, and I Want It All severely lack any sort of dynamics, with everything bleeding together into this sort of gray, colorless blob of sound. I mean, producer Catherine Marks has a history behind the scenes on a number of really solid albums, which kind of makes this more baffling than anything that she's not that great here. I mean, a number of very well-produced, well-mixed records in various spheres of rock music have her name stamped on them in some form or another. That includes mixing and production contributions on records ranging from PJ Harvey's classic White Chalk to more recent releases like Boy Genius's very solid The Record, or St. Vincent's modern kind of cult favorite Mass Seduction. And while her work on those records may have been quite important in ensuring that they sounded as expansive as they do, the opposite effect is achieved on Ricochet. I mean, perhaps it's because the style of music that Rise Against plays is naturally much louder, albeit, of course, not better exactly than anything brought to the table by those previously mentioned artists and albums at those respective points of their career. But this album just feels like it has no personality. It's wildly dull, almost to the point that it just becomes outright boring, no matter how in your face it tries to be. The guitars just have an unmemorable tone, the bass rumbles but with no real punch, and the drums are just far too dry for their own good. Making an impressive and innovative album is not what I expect from this band. I mean, I would say that's outright impossible with this very subdued direction that Rise Against have chosen to go in with Ricochet, so it should arguably come as no surprise that the same lackluster qualities can be attributed to the sonic qualities of the album as well. Sure, you definitely could say that. I mean, hell, I do kind of think that, but at the same time, it's just still a bummer that even a record that has a talented producer behind it could not be saved when the general sound that Rise Against are going for here is so boring in the first place. With all of that being said, it would also be wrong to say that any of this is a complete and total shock per se. As previously stated, Rise Against have never been the most groundbreaking band since day one of their career, and they've never really tried to fake it exactly. I mean, as the years have passed by, they've gotten progressively glossier with an even deeper focus on their melodicism, despite the fact that they've always kind of seemed incapable of outdoing their peers in that regard, but I digress. What can be cited as genuinely shocking, however, is that Ricochet's political message feels bizarrely muffled overall. It could be said that in a sense this is another change for Rise Against, with the bulk of their work being undeniably political, oftentimes to a somewhat preachy extent. Ricochet could be viewed as a change in pace for a band who are often criticized for only being able to write about a single topic, politics in its various forms. And I mean, while Ricochet is less direct in its political stances than some previous Rise Against records, in fact, it is very much less direct. It is still vague enough to just barely hold on to the band's title as one of the most politics-minded groups of their kind, while at the same time being just harmless enough that it just feels outright disappointing and even just somewhat cowardly at the end of the record. The issue comes when you realize just how vague the album is with these politics. I mean, take the track Soldier, for example. It deals with the topic of rejecting government-imposed loyalty to a military or some other government body, and with the chorus plainly stating, "I'm not your soldier anymore, not going to be part of the wars you fight, who's wrong, who's right," it quickly becomes clear just how bland the faux revolutionism is throughout Ricochet. Even if Rise Against didn't mean every word that they said in the past, they would still deliver it with enough conviction that it was easy to latch onto as punk music with a vaguely leftist message. And whether a lot of punks out there want to believe it or not, that is honestly a lot of political punk. Vaguely leftist messaging that's just meant to attract a crowd rather than actually say something or point something out of note. So I'm not necessarily shocked that it's vague. It's that I'm shocked that it's become even more vague. It's just atrocious to see, really. I mean, while they may have been mostly unremarkable as a songwriting-oriented band in the past, it was at least easy to find some sort of deeper statement as the listener. If Rise Against was once punk's version of, like, ice-cold tap water, this is them becoming room temperature at best. Tracks like the title cut and State of Emergency try to further develop discussions into topics like the impact of neutrality in the face of war, or modern paranoia in the digital age, respectively. But it all comes across as thin and meaningless, because it doesn't really feel like they're actually trying to say anything. At best, it just feels like Rise Against saying, yeah, that's a pretty rough part about being alive today, am I right or am I right, fellas? And that gets old quick, because no matter how hard the biggest Rise Against fans try to find something here, there's no way of finding some sort of earnest political belief system throughout Ricochet, because as the world descends into chaos with active genocides happening in Palestine and Sudan, homelessness rates at an all-time high in the United States, a new global health emergency arising seemingly every other day, it feels like Ricochet is the most damning evidence yet of Rise Against kind of poser status. The album chooses to cast a blind eye to the horrors of the world as a means to say nothing about anything, and to call that a failure to live up to their reputation would be an understatement. And I wouldn't have such a big issue with it if they were just earnestly trying to write songs about different things here. If they're getting a little more vulnerable, a little more personal. I'm not saying that every Rise Against album has to be socially and politically aware. I'm not saying that whatsoever, but it's very obvious that that's what they're trying to get across here still. So if that's what they're trying to say, then why become even more vague about it? Why sound even less certain in the things that you say? Why be even less direct? It's just obnoxious, because it feels like Rise Against trying to reassert themselves as a politically aware band, while at the same time trying to be as unspecific as possible for the sake of maybe drawing in new listeners. And whether that's a result of them going for even more of a stadium-ready sound, or if it's them trying to draw in new listeners at maybe the all-time low point of their career, that's up for debate. You, the viewer, can decide that. I'm not here for that, and I don't really care. My point is that this album is written horribly. As stated at the beginning of this review, Rise Against have never been the most beloved band in the world per se, with most of their records sounding the same, their political lyrics striking the same chords time and time again. Only those utterly in love with their sound stuck around after their commercial peak in the mid to late 2000s. But Ricochet manages to portray everything the aforementioned fanbase has ever held dear regarding the band by embracing an even more commercial sound that feels nothing short of passionless, with production that makes them sound desperate to play at the nearest stadium, when the best that this record's probably going to get them is your local county fair, maybe not even the main stage at your local county fair. But worst of all, Rise Against finally confirms a certain harsh reality that has perhaps always been obvious for those with the eyes to see. They aren't truly a political band. Like, they aren't really a political band. While they may write political songs and make their stances somewhat known outside of their music, their songwriting style is far too compromised and far too cowardly to ever directly touch on the state of the world or make any good points or act as a legitimate call to arms in any regard. And what the listener is left with Ricochet then is an album that is incapable of looking the world in the eye and attempts to chase the increasingly fleeting relevance of Rise Against in its place. It's an album that feels self-indulgent and self-obsessed at worst, and extremely mediocre at best. I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.